Om Shanti. So today is about perception and endurance and love. So these three are very connected with each other. And we've been talking about the difference between the soul and the body. And when you perceive anything, where do you perceive it? For example, you see something. Do you perceive it in your eyes or somewhere else? And when you hear something, do you perceive it in your ears or somewhere else? And when you touch something, do you perceive it in your skin or somewhere else? So all things that are occurring in the material world are not perceived through anything material. Well, they're perceived through material instruments, but by the mind. So everything which you perceive on the outside of your body is actually perceived in your soul. So it's not perceived where it is, it's perceived where you are. So mostly people don't know this because we think about sense perception, and if something is able to be replicated, then we say it is real. But then how is that replication perceived in the mind? So that means that all objective perception is ultimately subjective. So normally we think that subjective reality is less reliable than objective reality. But when we look at it in this angle, that the one who perceives is the soul, and you perceive it with your mind. Your mind is your instrument of perception, and that is entirely subjective. So that means that, you say the leaves on the tree are green, but your perception of green and someone else's perception of green may not be the same. But it's close enough to say that's green. But it might be a bluer green or a yellower green, or because your sense organs are not identical to the sense organs of the next person. And so you arrive at agreement about perception. So we're used to thinking of objective reality, but now we can think about perception itself, the act of perception, and the mind. You see, you all have a mind, presumably, but you don't know whether it's a thing or not, though it's a noun. You have a mind, you say, my mind, I have a mind, but you've never seen it. So you don't know if it looks like something or not. If it's not a thing, then it cannot look like something. So it's quite difficult to imagine your mind. because there's no possible picture of it. Because in fact your mind is not a thing at all. But our language suggests that it is, so we assume that it is. But it's more like a capability. Your eyes are definitely objects. You know what your eyes are like and how they function. But your mind is where visual perception is registered. So your eyes are like the camera lens. But the photograph you take doesn't stay in the lens. You get it through the lens. But nowadays you get a digital photograph, which is just like a piece of energy. And then you can represent it on a computer screen, or you can print it, or something like this. But this technology helps us to understand about these things more easily, because it's subtle. And the mind is a capability of the soul which can perceive material things, and it can also perceive non-material things. In order to perceive material things, you must have sense organs, you must have a body. So then, how does the mind exist without the body? Because it's part of the soul, so it has to exist independently of the body. And so there is an intermediate dimension between the material and the spiritual. And we call that the subtle. So the subtle dimension is where you can get an idea. You see, because before you make something, you have an idea of that thing that you will make, and then you make it physically. But initially it exists as an idea. Is that right? And where do ideas come from? Mostly it's a combination of memories and associations and imagination. And so you have a whole life that goes on, not in the material world, but in the world of your mind. And your mind can only be activated when it's associated with your brain. So there's a continuum between your soul and your mind and your body. But at the same time, there are three distinct dimensions: the non-material, the subtle or mental, and then the material. And your emotions are all in the mind. And when you experience different emotions, there is an effect on the body. So you have fear, and it may create adrenaline extra, or you feel calm, and it will create certain chemicals. Tears of joy are sweet, and tears of sorrow are salty. same tears produced by the same tear duct. But if the emotion is happiness, is sweet to the taste if you taste them. And if the emotion is distress or sorrow, they're salty. So this continuum of soul and mind and body is quite important to understand. So we're talking about here perception and endurance and love. The mind is a great power, but its power is neutralized through negative thought. So when you produce thoughts that are negative, then you destroy the power of your mind. And love is a calculation of positive thoughts. So when you perceive some external event which displeases you, then your response to that is to produce negative thoughts. And the consequence of that is you become bound to that negative event, and it will make you suffer. And you will be powerless to do anything about it, because your power will have been drained by that angle of negativity on the perception. And as a result of that, mostly people operate only in the physical dimension, in the sense of you give importance to it, you give significance to it, you consider this is reality. Material reality is everything. But when we start to learn these things, then it changes, because we're discovering the laws of spirituality which operate side by side with the laws of physics. And we have to take them into consideration in order to be fully empowered. So the process of achieving this involves, in many ways, these three things. Perception. You have to understand perception, what it is, who perceives, and then how you interpret your perception, because interpretation is important. Because you want to know, what are you perceiving? So if you are thinking about material reality, your thought process is you perceive that thing, and you will say this is a good thing or a bad thing or an interesting thing or a boring thing. You will assign a value to it. And your values will be a continuum between very positive and very negative. And so when you are in this process of perceiving material reality and giving it maximum significance and importance, then you are under the influence of the flip-flop between positive and negative. And that disempowers you. But unless you know that, you wouldn't stop doing it that way. But the one thing that people desire is power. You want to be loved, no doubt, but once you've got that, then you want power. People desire power. Because when you have power, you feel significant, you feel important, you feel value. So there is a connection between power and self-honor, in a way. But power is a very toxic thing. There is this expression, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and we need to understand what that is and how it is so that people desire the thing which is the most damaging and the most toxic of all things. It's a kind of addiction. And this whole thing changes when you understand more deeply about perception being something that occurs only in the mind. So the spiritual laws say that as long as you are engaged through your sense organs in perception of physical reality, then you are under the control of your mind. And if your mind is something that belongs to you, it is better if it is under your control than if you are under its control. Do you know how to ride a horse? You know? And if you don't know how to ride a horse and you get on a horse, what will happen? This horse takes control. And he will throw you around and jump up and down and do all sorts of things to basically disempower you. And the mind has often been compared with a horse, which means that the mind is a vehicle. And the way to use the mind and the way to master the mind is very necessary to know. And so in spiritual practice we work with this, mastering the mind. So the mind is something that generates thoughts, and these thoughts arise from perception, your response to what you perceive. They also arise from your subconscious. They also arise from memories, and on the whole there's a lot of associations that goes on in the mind. And the mind responds to where you have a lack. So there are desires where you have lack. And the tendency is that whatever comes up in your mind, that takes over your consciousness. And then it takes up your time and energy. So we also need to take command over our mechanism of perception, because perception is sitting on the mind. So in some ways the mind is like a container. In some ways it's like a screen. In some ways it's like a tongue. It can taste, you know. And all emotions are felt in the mind, and you can be overwhelmed by very strong emotions. And so the problem for a human being in the present time, in the present world of where dominance is given to material reality and how perception operates in it, so you are a slave of your mind. And do you like that? Not really. Can you do anything about it? Not that much. And so the idea is to be the master of your physical instruments and your subtle instruments. So along with the mind, you also have your intelligence, which is another subtle instrument. It is your power to focus your mind where you want to focus it. So concentration is a skill that's needed when you want to be the master of your mind. So in spiritual language, we call that the intellect. And you can call it the intelligence, you can call it conscience, you can call it the will, and your decision-making power. And it needs to be in a commanding position in your consciousness, because when this is in power, then the other parts of your consciousness come under its control. And that cannot be achieved effectively by force. It has to be done by more by wisdom or by understanding. And if you issue an order to any part of your consciousness, that part of your consciousness must immediately obey. Otherwise, you're a slave. So, where does love figure in this? Love is not a warm, fuzzy feeling. Sometimes you get a warm, fuzzy feeling and you say, I need more of this, give me love. But there's another explanation of love or description of love, which is that you do not do anything that diminishes your dominance as the master of your life. When you perceive some event outside of your body and you apply love, how that works is that you are neutral about it, insofar as it may be a good thing or a bad thing. But you have a personal ethical policy of considering it as a neutral event, because you'll take it in as a neutral event. And when you take it in as a neutral event, you decide how you feel about it and what you will do about it in such a way that the result is beneficial for you. So you do not evaluate it in terms of whether it's good or not according to conventional moral principles, because if you evaluate it as that, then you will be taken over by it. And so therefore it's counterproductive to do that. If you want to be spiritually empowered and free. If not, then it doesn't matter. But if you want, then you have to look at it in a different way. So there is a mantra. I didn't give you a mantra, or I did give you a mantra. I did give you a mantra, yeah, Vashikaran mantra. Yeah, you remember that? So now I give you a different mantra. This is also a very powerful mantra. And this is a mantra which came up in our study earlier this morning, which is Man Mana Bhav. And Man Mana Bhav means perceive the mind of God with your mind. So that is a recommendation and an instruction. Now how will you put that into effect? How do you perceive the mind of anyone? You perceive what's in someone's mind through what they say and what they do, and what their vibration is. Is that right? Because whatever is in someone's mind, it will emerge as words and actions and vibrations. So this is how you can tell what's in someone's mind, including if they're lying. I see. But you have to have a very well-tuned mind so that you can detect what's real, even if it's being dissembled or hidden away. So when we don't use our mind correctly, it loses functionality. Just as when we do action that is against our conscience, the conscience itself loses functionality. Do you want that? Not really, yeah? Because the most reliable guide you have is your conscience. And so if your conscience is in good order and your mind is very well tuned, then you can be completely self-reliant. You do not need to ask anyone for advice. Well, you know, because your instruments of perception are sharp. And so we have to keep our instruments in good order. These are called weapons. A warrior always keeps his weapons sharp and oiled and ready to go, because these are the instruments. So love is also a kind of weapon. A weapon in the sense, in India, the word for tools and weapons is the same word. So that's quite interesting. Your weapons and your tools is one and the same thing. So your instruments, your mind, your powers of perception, these are, it's not you say that, oh, I felt this thing, therefore I had no choice. No, whatever you perceive, you decide what it's going to be. And you decide according to your personal ethical policy. That means that how you take something in is determined by you and not by it. Whether it's an event or a person or a place or an object. So for example, you may have an item and it stops working. Then you feel irritated or angry or something because you are relying on this instrument to work properly. And when it doesn't, then you have a feeling about it. So in a situation like that, the practice is, okay, this instrument has stopped working, so be it. It is what it is. It's not good, it's not bad, it just is. Use this also as a good mantra. Some person is behaving in a way that does not conform to your expectation of how they should behave. That happens, right? And when they do that, it will elicit a feeling and some sort of a negative feeling. So when we come under the influence of that negative feeling, then we will entertain it, we will have a series of thoughts about it, and we will amplify the feeling of negativity. And we may leave it just on an amplified feeling level, or we may start having a self-talk about it, or that may come into a comment about it to someone else, and you may decide to do something about it. And as it progresses through these stages, the amount of negative energy is getting built up. And unless you know that it is disempowering you, you don't have any reason to not do that. But once you know that it disempowers you, you have a good reason to not do that, because the most important, the higher priority is to stay in your power. And as you mentioned a little while ago, attempting to change people invariably fails. You know, if you have an instrument that doesn't work and you know how to fix it, you can fix it. And if you don't know how to fix it, you find somebody who does. But this requires this energy called love, which takes the form of patience and deciding not to react, and deciding to stay in your power, evaluating, can you do anything about it or not? If not, then it's necessary to let it go. And to be easy about it. So this love is really for you. Though it is extended that you do not take revenge or something like this, but it's not really about what's outside you. More than anything, it's about you. Because it's the way that you stay in your power. And so we say detachment. In the sense that if you are attached to something being a certain way, you will expend energy to try and force it to be that way, which it will not be. And so all your energy is dissipated fruitlessly. And so this is called leakage or waste. And all that happens is you get disempowered. No other thing happens. If you engage in a negative interaction with the other person, or you think negatively about the other person, then along with losing power, you also come in debt. So then you have to pay. So ultimately, it's economically not very sensible. So you have to really look at these things in economic terms, because this is all about the deep philosophy of karma. When we give maximum importance to our perception of physical reality, and we give it maximum significance, then we become dependent on the material world, and we take support from it. So what we need to do is to think about the material world as unreliable, and know that it is fundamentally unreliable because it is continuously in a state of flux. So in ancient times, they used to think of material reality as in a state of flux, but in modern times they don't use that expression so much. But in a state of flux means it's constantly deteriorating and changing. So if you want to have a solid foundation and you select something that is constantly deteriorating and changing, it would be called a bad choice. So that would be called unwise. And then when your support system fails you, you don't like it. But it would be said that how can you expect it to not fail you? It's in its very nature to fail you. And if you didn't understand that, then start understanding. And so the key instrument for gaining this kind of understanding is disillusionment. Because disillusionment is a very unpleasant experience, which occurs when something that you thought was real and solid and true and good turns out to be not so. Then you feel betrayed and disillusioned. A lot of people run their lives as if they will not die. And then when they get close to death, they realize that everything that they thought was solid and real and so on, they lose everything. And the more you put your identity with those things, the more you are deluded. And then the moment of disillusionment is very important, because the feeling is so strong that it's enough to get you to rethink your perception or your interpretation of what you perceive. And so spirituality says now, supports from below are unreliable, but support from above is more reliable. But it's intangible. However, you can perceive it with your mind, but you cannot perceive it through any other sense organ. So, for example, the description of God is invisible, intangible, and immutable, and imperceptible, but can be understood. if you have sufficient information. So the instrument of consciousness for understanding the intangible is your intelligence. Because with your intelligence you can understand an intangible concept. And the language for that is mathematics and music. Right? So we do have language for these things. But our orientation is much more to do with sense perception. So the other one that you cannot perceive is yourself, your soul. It's very hard for a person in the face of death to consider themselves immortal. So you have to risk facing it and going through it. And then you realize, oh yeah, I'm dead. I'm not dead, but I left my body. So it's called dead. We had one very amusing story about one of the yogis. Because in spiritual practice, sometimes people go in trance. They leave their body and go into what we call the subtle region. And they have nice spiritual experiences over there. And so this Dadi, we call them Dadis, the older ones, she thought, oh great, finally I'm getting a nice trance experience, and went to the world of the spirits and had a nice time there, and said, okay, now I'm going back. I said, no, you're dead. I am. Are you sure? Yeah, you can't go back. You can only go forward. Really? And so, because some of us can go and check out these things, we could find out the story. But it was very interesting that helps you to understand that when you leave your body, you remain conscious, but you just don't have your body. But what you do have is a shadow form of your body, sometimes called the etheric body or the subtle body. And your mind and intelligence can function with the subtle body, because your mind, intelligence, intellect, all this is subtle instruments, so they can work with the subtle body. When you leave your subtle body and you go to nirvana, then you can't do anything. You just exist in a seed form, like in a potential form, but you can't think or feel or anything. But you still exist. So in the physical form is the most tangible, and there's the subtle form, and then there's the incorporeal form. And that's the way it is. So we have to be able to perceive the mind of God. Why? Because then you can understand the angle of vision of God on life. And then you can have a similar angle of vision, which is quite a good one to have, because it's an undisturbed vision. Undisturbed because you see the whole picture. When you see the whole picture, you see what they say for a diamond, is you can see it better if it's sitting on a piece of black velvet. That's called a foil. And so you can see the reality of things better when you see the good against the bad and the bad against the good. Because then you are looking at it in a totality where you can truthfully say, it's not good, it's not bad, it just is. And when you can say that, it just is, then you can let it go. And this is called detachment. And the symbol of detachment is the lotus. And the lotus, the context of the lotus is a stagnant, quite disgusting pond, which is all tangled up with other lotus roots and leaves and whatnot. But when you look at the lotus pond from far, you really just see the flowers. You don't really pay attention to the other part. And so the symbol of the lotus is a good symbol for perception. And you can see the real value and beauty of everything when you are independent of considering things as good or bad. It is. And then your attention is on the flower, the beauty. That's a choice. You choose to see what is most meaningful, what is most significant. Otherwise, when we are under the influence of sense perception, then we see what moves most rapidly. And the most rapid moving items in the world today is advertising. The cuts are less than a second. And if you turn off the sound on advertising, you can see how much it's going fast, and it's pulling your mind so that you lose control of your mind through that rapidity. And the rhythm of advertising is contrary to your natural brainwaves, and so it disempowers you. They know that. They do it on purpose. But it doesn't mean we have to be taken by it. That's optional. Because we have to exercise our power of choice. And we get continuously exposed to stuff which displeases us. Am I right? And this is exercise. All the things that displease you are specifically placed there by the divine so that you can know where you are weak. Because if you don't know where you're weak, you're vulnerable. But if you know where you're weak, then you can shore yourself up against that particular weakness and become invulnerable or immune. So with the COVID, just avoiding it, it'll get you. So you have to have antibodies so that you're ready to deal with it when it comes, right? Support, the third thing. So first is yourself. I am immortal. The second is the one above. This is support. And the third is that everything, whatever happens in the material world, is a pattern of light and dark, and you have to take the whole thing, because that's its nature. If you like the light and you don't like the dark, it means you haven't understood. So it's about accepting that it is made up of light and dark, and they are there, and tell yourself it's not good, it's not bad, it just is. And anyway, it doesn't last very long. The thing which displeases you has a duration, fixed duration. Could be a long time, but eventually it'll stop. So the nature of these things is they're short-lived, they're temporary. But yourself is not temporary. Your personal ethical policy to take in a positive way whatever's going on is a decision, so that can be permanent. And your perception of the totality is, it is like this. You cannot make it to be not what it is. You have to say, this is what it is, and be in harmony with it. And then you can endure. Because endurance is for the things that displease you, like pain, like conflict, like it doesn't go the way you want it to go, it doesn't do what you anticipated it would do, and. So enduring these things, considering them to be, it is what it is, and relying on things which are more intangible, your power of endurance becomes very strong. And then you are masters. Then you are masters. An interesting way to think about God, which people don't normally do. God is very conscious of the totality of human suffering and feels it, but endures it. And that's a lot more than anybody knows. A lot more. Physical pain, financial pain, political pain, torture, torment, many, many different types of things. Anything that is registered in a human mind is perceived by God. So you have to be very powerful to endure that as a very sensitive being. Right? We are sensitive, but God is much more sensitive. So what is God? As a being, a non-human being who is very sensitive to human suffering. And the love of God is to inform us what to do to be able to manage all these things and be free and independent, and to not do anything which disempowers ourselves or which makes us unable. We become able in all situations. So this is called love. So we have to love ourselves, endure what's going on, and perceive from an angle where everything is acceptable because we understand the way it is. And that's a better way to be. But it's not easy because your context is the total opposite. And your experience of life has created what we call the sanskaras of being very much affected by good and bad, right and wrong, all these things, because we take them to be highly significant. So we're shifting, and it's a paradoxical situation because we need to be aware that there is right and wrong, good and bad, and so on, but it doesn't enslave us or diminish us, or we don't lose ourselves in it, and we don't do things or think things that cause us to get caught by it and damaged by it. You follow me? So every second of every day is some sort of exam. This is school. And we have to be alert to know what we're being tested on and what is the meaning of the test and what positioning we have to adopt to pass the test. And this is how we become masters. And this practice of perceiving the mind of God with your mind is to perceive the reality of the incorporeal, the subtle and the physical from the angle that that one sees it, so that you can see from the same angle, and then it's manageable. Otherwise it's becoming increasingly unmanageable. Because we do have to survive and thrive. Om Shanti.